Alright, so it is Monday of my second week of my neurology rotation, and honestly it's kind of like my first week because last week was all jumbled and weird. We didn't have Monday, Tuesday was my orientation, I had 2 ED shifts, and then finally Friday I actually had something neurology related, but it was actually neurosurgery. So really today is my first day of neurology. So I'm on the epilepsy service this week. The way my neuro rotation works is you're on a different specialty every single week. So last week was supposed to be my subspecialty clinic week where you're in a different subspecialty every day, but like I said, it was kind of messed up with having Memorial Day and an orientation and stuff. So this week is epilepsy. It's really nice. The site that I'm at has a pretty big, like, dedicated neuro hospital almost. It's just called like the Neuroscience Institute. They sort of have their own wing of the hospital. They have a few floors. They have their own neuro ICU. And they have a bunch of residents. I want to say there's probably like at least 20 residents total. So with that, they're able to staff a bunch of different like dedicated neuro teams. So like I said, I'm on epilepsy this week. The next week I'll be on stroke. I'll have a general neuro week. So it's good to be able to see all the different specialties and be able to focus on one thing for the whole week. So today was my first day of epilepsy. I went and got there around 7. There wasn't really any sign out, but I just wanted to be there with enough time to see my patient, do chart checking, all that kind of stuff. So I was just assigned one patient. They had a very rare sort of genetic syndrome that caused, recurrent seizures. So that was interesting that I saw something pretty rare on my first day. Epilepsy is probably the most like relaxed service that they have at the hospital just because, general neuro and stroke, it's just more common. So those teams have a lot more patients. So I think today we only had like 8 patients on the list, so rounds really didn't take too long. We did walking rounds, which is something that I'm not like super used to in like IM and surgery. We would always do table rounds. Most of the time that would be it. And then some attendings would like to do walking rounds after, but that's, just like going and seeing the patient. You don't really have to present on the spot. So that was something I really wasn't expecting. I'm glad that I kind of wrote everything on paper because normally at table rounds you're able to like have a computer and I will use my note sort of to help present, but it was honestly fine. The attending didn't really want like a super in-depth presentation. It was really just like updates, so it wasn't too bad. Saw the patients and then got to study a lot for a few hours, and then in the afternoon went to see some consults, stuff that weren't necessarily seizure based, but they were just kind of consults to the neuro residents in general. We saw them, work them up, and then sort of handed them off to either the stroke or the general neuro team, whichever sort of fit best. Another interesting thing was a few of the patients on our list weren't necessarily like admitted to the hospital or didn't have anything really going on acutely, but they were here just to get like a long-term 24-hour video EEG. So an EEG is just like a way to look at the brain activity. It's all those different electrodes on your scalp, and they're able to see the wave patterns of the electrical activity of your brain to sort of determine if you have epilepsy or not. It's a really good way to differentiate a seizure that is caused by epilepsy or some other reason. So there were a few patients who, some did have established epilepsy, and we were put them on a video EEG and then took them off some of their medications to try to induce a seizure, to more like localize where the seizure activity was coming from. And the benefit of the video EEG is you can line up sort of the brain waves with a certain time and then look at them on the video to see what they're doing. There's a lot of nuances of epilepsy and seizures and like the certain movements that happen. If the patient has their eyes open or closed, that sort of means something different. If they're aware, if they're conscious, that's sort of less likely to be a seizure. So just from sort of going through some of the video EEGs, I learned a lot about epilepsy and seizures, and I can see why there's a whole like subspecialty dedicated to it because it is pretty complex. And I thought that EKGs were hard to read, but EEGs are so much more difficult. You have a lot of artifacts from like muscle movement, and every time the patient blinks, you see like a different spike. So it can take a lot of practice to like understand the patterns that you normally would see with epilepsy, try to filter out all the noise. It is Thursday morning. I don't have to head to the hospital for a few more minutes, so I thought I'd give you a little update. So Tuesday was very similar to Monday, just saw one patient. It was a new patient. The resident thought that it's best to see sort of a new patient every day, so you can keep going through the process of chart checking someone new instead of just following the same patient for every day. And unlike internal medicine, where there's usually a lot of stuff to check up on every single day, when you're in more of a subspecialized field like neurology, there's many days where you only see half the patients on the list just because maybe you're waiting for an MRI, or you're on board, or you're on board for the patient, but they need cardiology to see them or whatever. So that's why it's kind of better to re-look at the list every single day and try to see a new patient. And then yesterday, Wednesday, was a bit of a different day. We didn't go in to the hospital because we had another OSCE. So the way that my school works is there's an OSCE that is associated with every block that you do in the last week, kind of right around when you do the written shelf exam, and it's part of your grade. But we also have 4 block OSCEs, which are more of intense, bigger, more general OSCEs to assess us even further. I don't really know why we do it. It might be like an accreditation thing, but 2 during preclinical. One was, I think, like at the end of our heart, lung, renal block. Then we had another one like right before we started clerkships. And since we're halfway through clerkships, we have our 3rd one, and then our last one will be at the end of clerkships. It's kind of interesting because, everyone does the same OSCE. That's how they keep it standardized and how they can actually grade students fairly, I guess. But people have done all different rotations. So half of us have done internal, family, and surgery. And then the other half has done psych, neuro, peds, and OB. So, half of the students have done stuff that's a lot more like specialized. The other half, a lot more general. So at first I was like, how are they going to make us all do the same OSCE? It's going to be kind of tough to make it fair because, if they give us like a pure surgical thing, like people who've done surgery will do a lot better. It was 5 encounters. 3 of them were standardized patients, and then 2 of them were sort of like our high-tech mannequin encounters, where it's more of like an acute situation, either like in the ED or, the patient is admitted and they're, crashing or whatever. So with those, we've done those in all of our block OSCEs. You can usually predict what it's going to be. It's going to be some sort of like shock or some cardiac arrhythmia, just because that's usually why rapids are called in the hospital, so they want to get us used to that. So those weren't too bad. Those were pretty expected. And then the SP encounters, once again, weren't terrible. They really tried to pick things that could have popped up in multiple things, like family med and psych. They tend to have some overlap. And then the other 2 were honestly more things that we could have seen in the ED. That was the setting for the encounter, was in the emergency department. So I didn't really think about that beforehand, but that's a good place for them to pull from to test us, because even though we've kind of done 2 different sets of rotations, everyone does ED shifts. At that point, everyone had done like at least 6 shifts. Some people have done a little bit more. So by doing stuff that you would see in an ED setting, it kind of made it more of like an even playing field. So that was last night. It was a long day for me because I had the 2nd session, so I didn't start till like 1. And then also we had like an ED lecture after. at 6 p.m. But the OSCE was up at the school and I really didn't have time to come all the way back down to where I live. So I just had to stay there for the lecture and then had to drive home at like 7:30. So it was a long day. And thankfully for these ones, it's really more of just like a pass fail of like, all right, are you where you should be at this point? It's not really related to any of our clerkship grades. So the stakes of that were a little bit lower. So I'm about to head into work. Should just be a normal day. And then at noon we have like one of our clerkship lectures. It's neurobehavioral, so like dementia, stuff like that. Kind of interesting how all the different clerkships do their lectures, because every clerkship still has some sort of lecture component. Some of them will have like a whole dedicated day, so you just don't go into the hospital that day, and you will have lectures from like 8 to 1. And then some of them, like neurology, you go into the hospital every day, but they'll just have lectures sort of randomly throughout the week. So we have one today at noon. Sometimes they're kind of after the clinical day, so at like 4 or 5. I definitely prefer just having a dedicated day to it, so you can just focus on the hospital those 4 days that you're there instead of worrying about like your day being broken up by lecture, because sometimes like you're still rounding, so you don't want to be like, hey, I have to leave rounds right in the middle because I have a lecture. All right, it is Friday. I'm done with my second week of neuro rotation. All in all, I really enjoyed it. It was interesting being in something that is like so specialized. My first 3 rotations were in IM, FM, and surgery, so more of like the general specialties, and you're really having to think about everything in terms of patient care and sort of coordinate all the specialists. So it was kind of nice being one of those specialists and really just focusing in on your expertise. So while sometimes it is nice being that general person who really has to, take everyone's recommendations and figure out the best plan for the patient, that sometimes it is nice to just focus on your thing and then leave everything else to the other doctors. In terms of how much I liked epilepsy specifically, I think hearing the story of the patient, like what their symptoms are, sometimes witnessing a seizure can be really interesting, but other than that, it's a lot of just like medication management, trying different stuff out, different doses, multiple medications to see what's going to work. And then also, I think I'll probably go insane if I ever have to read another EEG again. The doctor I was with is like an absolute expert, and, she was just able to figure out if someone was having epileptic episodes like instantly. And I know that just comes with practice, but like I said, those EEGs are just extremely hard to read, especially someone who is brand new to them. I did learn a lot though, and learned that seizures don't always come from epilepsy. There was a lot of patients this week who were either having pseudo seizures because they had PTSD or they're having panic attacks. We had a patient who was having sort of seizure-like activity, but it was more like a hypotension issue. So it was like a cardiac thing, not really anything to do with the brain. So that was nice to sort of see, once again, the expertise of the physician. As soon as she heard the story of, the patient started to have these jerking movements when she sat up. She had a history of heart failure. She was in there for an infection. She was like, all right, this is not epilepsy, this is something cardiac. One of the more interesting things that happened this week was we had a patient who was in there for like the voluntary video EEGs because they had pretty refractory epilepsy. They were on 3 medications and were still having breakthrough seizures. It was sort of the first step in evaluating them for like a surgical intervention. If patients keep failing different types of medications and you're kind of exhausted all your options, then there's a few different surgical things you can do. You can do a vagal nerve stimulator, which sort of just sits beneath the skin, and that can help calm down their seizures. Or you can actually do epileptic surgery. And, I don't really know anything about it. I would have to look into it a lot more. But just the way that the doctor was describing it, it seems like it's very intense, very involved. You have to go through extensive testing, because essentially what they try to do is go into your brain and ablate or remove the part of your brain that is causing the seizure. But with that being said, brain is so complex, there's so many different functions, and if you're off by a few millimeters, maybe you take out their language centers, so now they can't either interpret or produce speech. She was just saying how if that patient wanted to go down that road, there would be a lot more testing involved, a lot more, a bunch of conversations with the neurosurgeon to talk about the risks and benefits. So yeah, that was probably one of the more interesting patients all week. But I think that this was a really informative and important week for me to learn that not all seizures are just epilepsy. You really have to keep a broad differential to think about things that aren't even related to the brain that might be causing something that looks like a seizure. Alright, well that is going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like below and subscribe if you want to see videos like this in the future. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.